Hi, welcome back. This is chapter 24, The Interview. Although Brendan the bully wasn't bullying Armet anymore and Mr. Irons had gone, I was still feeling worried. 8 whole days had passed since our emergency adventure and Armet's parents still hadn't been found. And although Mrs. Sanders had said the Queen couldn't really help us, I knew that deep down we were still hoping that she would do something. The hardest thing was trying to make Armet understand that the Queen wasn't able to help. Every morning, as soon as he would see us in the playground, he would ask, "The Queen will find today, yes?" After a few days of trying to tell him no and seeing him look sad, we began to shrug and say maybe, as hopefully as we could. "The gates will have been shut last Friday," said Josie, as she gave her ponytail an angry pull. Even though we didn't usually have PE on Thursdays, Mrs. Khan had decided to treat us. So we were all sitting on a bench waiting for the climbing frame and feeling sad. "Armet, your turn," said Tom, pointing to the free space at the climbing frame. Armet ran over to the bars and leapt up onto the highest rung he could reach. He was as good at climbing as he was at football. When I asked him how high he could jump and how he could climb so fast, he shrugged and said, "Fences." "If the gates are shut already and no one's helping us to find Armet's family, why do you think the reporters are still here?" asked Michael, carefully patting the sides of his afro so that it would stay in place when it was his turn on the climbing frame. It was a question all of us had been asking ourselves, because even though there were fewer reporters than last week, they were still asking us questions about Armet whenever they saw us. "Maybe they'll think we'll try and do something else to help Armet find his family, and they're just waiting to see what it is," suggested Josie. For the rest of the day we tried our best not to think about the reporters and the newspaper appeal and the Queen, but on the way back home a reporter suddenly shouted, "Kids, what do you think of Mr. Fry's views about refugee children like Armet?" And another one shouted, "Do you have a response? Do you want to say anything back to him?" We all said no comment, just like we always did, but we gave each other a puzzled look. None of us knew who Mr. Fry was, and what he had to do with us or Armet, but we promised each other we would try and find out that night. When I got home that afternoon I found lots more reporters in front of my flat. It was strange because there had only been one or two before, but now there were at least 50, and they were all shouting questions at us about Mr. Fry. I ran past all of them just as fast as I could and saw Mum standing just inside the main gate, looking out for me. "Mum!" I cried out, running up and hugging her as she quickly buzzed the door open. "You're home early!" Mum hugged me back and hurried me inside. When we got to our flat I could see the television was on, which was another sign that something odd was happening, because Mum only really watches telly at night. Quickly switching off the telly, Mum bent down to look me closely in the eye and asked, "Are you okay? It can be scary having so many people chasing you and asking you questions." I nodded. "But Mum, why are you home early?" Mum stroked my cheek before replying, "Because I need you to do something that's really important and help us all help Armet." Motioning for me to sit down at the kitchen table, Mum placed a large peanut butter sandwich in front of me and a glass of milk. My stomach gave a growl because it likes peanut butter sandwiches the best, even though it makes my mouth go sticky. "Darling, do you know who Mr. Fry is? He came to your school once, a long time ago. He's our local MP." I frowned and shook my head. "But the reporters were asking about him." "I bet they were," said Mum, shaking her head as she sat down opposite me. Grabbing some newspapers from the kitchen counter, she spread them out in front of me. "This is why," she said. Her voice was calm, but her cheeks were pink, so I could tell she was cross about something. I looked down at the newspapers. They were all different, but they all had the same picture on the front page. It was of a man with grey hair, wearing a dark suit and a blue tie, and above him in big letters were headlines like, "No more refugees, influx flooding Britain," and "Britain's needs must come first," and "MP Fry labels Buckingham Palace kids radical refugee terrorists." My heart beat fast as the last headline. But before I could read anything else, Mum gathered the papers back up again. "Let's put these aside for now, darling. I don't want to read any articles, because most of what it says is just silly nonsense." I watched as she put the newspapers back on the counter and then faced me again. "The reason I showed them to you is because I wanted you to see the kinds of headlines Mr. Fry has helped to create today, and for you to understand that there are some people like him who think refugee children like Armet shouldn't be allowed in the country." "But why not, Mum?" I asked, feeling angry. "They haven't done anything wrong." "I know that, and I'm sure deep down they know that too. But remember what we said about some people being afraid of anything that's different to them, or anyone." So you mean Mr. Fry and all the people like him are just like Mr. Greggs? I asked, scrunching up my nose as if the name smelled. Yes, exactly, grinned Mum, and after a few seconds the grin disappeared. But there's also something else you need to know. Mr. Fry, you see, has said it was Ahmet who made you and Tom go to Buckingham Palace that day, and... But that's a lie! I cried out, feeling my cheeks beginning to burn. I know it is, darling, and so do lots of other people, but that's why I had a long talk on the phone with Mrs. Sanders, and, well, we've come up with a plan. I sat up and, pushing my sandwich plate away, I told my ears to listen extra carefully, because any plan of my mum's would be the best plan ever. Now, we think that people like Mr. Fry shouldn't be on the front pages of any newspaper. It's your story and Ahmet's story that people need to hear. So how do you feel about talking to a newspaper reporter today and telling them all about your letter to the Queen and Ahmet trying to find his family and all the things that you've done for each other? But you told me to say no comment. I know I did. I wanted to protect you and Ahmet too. But when people like Mr. Fry start telling lies, it's time to speak out, said Mum. So you mean I should tell them about the greatest idea in the world and the emergency plan and the Queen and everything? I asked, feeling both scared and excited. Yes, said Mum, but it won't just be you on your own. Tom and Josie and Michael and Ahmet will be with you too, and you can all share your story together. I clapped my hands. Mum, that's the best plan in the world. Mum laughed and, getting up, said, I'm glad you think so. Now finish the sandwich and let's get back to school. Mrs. Sanders has suggested we hold the interview in your classroom, so we need to be there in... Mum looked at her watch. Half an hour. Plenty of time for you to wash your face and look your best too. Chop, chop. I gobbled down my peanut butter sandwich, gulped down my glass of milk, scrubbed my face, brushed my hair, polished my school shoes, and checked I had the greatest idea in the world with me in my rucksack. Got Mum to tie my school tie extra neatly. I thought I had done everything in 3 minutes, but then Mum said, that was good for 10 minutes, which made me look at the clock and shake my head at it. As we headed downstairs to the main door, Mum grabbed my hand and said, we're going to have to run very fast to the bus stop, okay? Let's pretend all the journalists are zombies out to get us. I nodded and grabbed Mum's hand tightly. I tried to tell my heart to stop thumping so loudly because there weren't really any zombies around, but it wouldn't listen. I ran just as fast as I could, pulling Mum behind me. I heard her say, in a rush, no comment, until we reached the bus stop. When we got to school and walked into our classroom, Tom, Michael and Josie were already there with their parents, and Ahmet was there with his foster mum and Miss Hemsey too. Mrs. Khan was talking to 2 people I'd never seen before, but Michael told us that one was a lawyer and the other was a caseworker. What do you think they're talking about? Asked Josie, looking at the grown-up standing in the corner and whispering. Probably about that horrible MP who's saying Ahmet made us go to Buckingham Palace, I said. Really? Mum and Dad didn't tell me anything about that, said Josie. They just said if I helped tell the story, we'd get some money for a proper holiday. Just then, Mrs. Sanders walked in, followed by a woman in a suit and a man with a camera. It's them, whispered Josie loudly. The reporters. Everyone, said Mrs. Sanders, waving them forward. This is Miss Hall and Mr. Myers. We looked up at Miss Hall and Mr. Myers, who smiled and waved at us. And this is Ahmet's caseworker, Mrs. Khalid, said Mrs. Khan, pointing at a woman in the glasses standing next to Michael's mum. We all smiled. Let's begin, shall we? Clapped Mrs. Sanders. First, Miss Hall is going to speak to the 4 of you about the greatest idea in the world, and then she's going to speak to Ahmet, with Miss Hemsey's help, of course. And Mr. Myers will be filming you all, and then we'll take some nice pictures of your plans. Have you got them? Right here, said Mum, holding up my rucksack. After Mrs. Sanders and everyone had finished fussing with our hairs and our collars and our jumpers, we all sat in a row and the interview began. Okay, bye.